I caught my in-laws stealing my inheritance. I exposed them at a family gathering. My hands trembled as I stared at the documents, the legal jargon blurring through my tears. I had just discovered irrefutable proof that my in-laws, the people I had foolishly trusted, had systematically siphoned off my inheritance. They had smiled at me, and offered me comforting words about my late husband, all while meticulously plotting to rob me blind. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of disbelief and fury threatening to consume me. It wasn't just the money, though it was a substantial amount, it was the sheer betrayal. My husband, Mark, was barely cold on the ground, and his parents had already deemed me an easy target. I felt a knot of anguish tightens in my stomach, wondering how they could treat me, Mark's wife, like this. I thought of the countless family dinners, the forced smiles, and the polite conversations, and I realized they had all been a charade. Each memory was now tainted with this ugly truth. I would expose them, I had to. I wouldn't let them get away with this theft, with this heartless treachery. The upcoming family gathering would not be the usual polite affair, it would be a reckoning. My name is Adeline, and my life, before this nightmare began, was a quiet, comfortable symphony of routine. I married Mark, a kind, gentle man who was my best friend, my confidant, and the love of my life. We met in college, both studying literature and bonded over a shared love for classic novels and rainy afternoons in cozy cafes. Our life was simple but rich with affection and shared dreams. We lived in a beautiful craftsman-style home in a quiet suburb, a home filled with the echoes of our laughter and plans for our future. Mark's family, the Thorntons, always seemed like the ideal picture of a loving, supportive clan. His parents, Richard and Eleanor, were the epitome of suburban respectability, with their perfectly manicured lawn and polite smiles. Mark's siblings, a younger brother, David, and an older sister, Susan, seemed equally pleasant, though there was always a slight undercurrent of competitiveness between them. I had always worked hard to fit in, to be accepted as part of their family. I remember feeling initially slightly intimidated by their perfect presentation, but grew to think of them as my family. I would often stay at their house for extended visits during the holidays, during which I would bake cookies, help with chores, and be the perfect daughter-in-law. I never questioned their sincerity, naively believing they cared about me as I did about them. Little did I know that beneath the surface of that perfect facade, dark secrets were brewing, and their true nature was a mask of greed. Mark and I had discussed starting a family after he finished his MBA program. We talked about the names of our future children, and the trips we would take. Our dreams seemed on the cusp of coming true. Then, the unimaginable happened. Mark's sudden death in a car accident shattered my world. He was gone in an instant, leaving me adrift in a sea of grief. The days that followed were a blur of tear-filled moments and numbing grief. The funeral was a cruel, surreal experience, watching my beloved Mark in the coffin. I was shattered into a million pieces. It was during this period of intense mourning that the Thorntons stepped up. They handled most of the funeral arrangements, offering words of comfort and promises of support. They seemed genuinely heartbroken, or so I thought. Richard even told me, with tears in his eyes, that I was like a daughter to him and that he and Eleanor would always be there for me. Those words, delivered with such earnestness, had given me a flicker of hope. I had been so vulnerable that I wanted to believe them. I had no family of my own, so they were everything to me. They had urged me to move into Mark's parents' house temporarily until I was stable enough to return to my own home. Little did I know, that move would unknowingly set the stage for their audacious scheme. Richard Thornton, Mark's father, was a man of impeccable appearance and calculated charm. He was a retired lawyer, a profession that had honed his skills in manipulation and deception. Beneath his polished exterior, he was a man driven by a deep-seated need for control and money. Eleanor, his wife, was an expert at playing the role of the sweet, doting mother. However, underneath her gentle smiles and soft words lay a calculating mind that matched her husband's. She always wanted the best for her family, and money was the only thing that equated to the best for her. They had always been financially comfortable, but for some reason, it was never enough. Their lifestyle had always involved fine dining, expensive vacations, and designer clothes. The Thorntons loved to flaunt their wealth, subtly. It was important to them to be seen as the upper class. They always seemed to have a knack for knowing exactly what to say to make people feel comfortable, while secretly judging them. They were the epitome of passive aggressiveness. David, Mark's younger brother, was a shadow of his father's ambition and greed. He was always envious of Mark's success, particularly his marriage to me. I was an established author, and he never felt like he was accomplishing anything important. He was always trying to one-up Mark, and since he was now gone, he seemed to be trying to one-up my situation. I had always felt a slight unease around David, but I was never able to pinpoint exactly why until recently. He had always been subtly disparaging about my writing career, implying that it wasn't a real job. Susan, Mark's elder sister, was a successful real estate agent. She was the family's designated go-getter, who had her own ambitions. She shared the family's materialistic tendencies. She always condescendingly spoke to me and gave me unwanted advice about how to live my life. She would always make sure to remind me that she was older and therefore wiser. As for me, I am an author, a writer who finds solace in the quiet solitude of storytelling. I have always been fiercely independent. My parents passed away when I was young, so I learned early how to take care of myself. I had worked diligently and saved diligently to build my life with Mark. I believed in integrity and honesty, principles that I thought were shared by the family I married into. I naively believed that the Thorntons cared for me, or at least respected me, but it turns out I was a pawn in their game. Mark's passing had left me vulnerable and emotionally raw, and they had seen me as an easy target. They had manipulated my grief, and now I could see it clearly. All the kind gestures and offers of help were nothing but a calculated charade. My husband had inherited a significant sum of money from his grandfather, a legacy that he planned to invest in our future. After Mark's death, that inheritance had legally passed to me, his wife, but the Thorntons, led by Richard, had begun to systematically transfer these funds into their accounts, making it appear as routine management of the estate. They convinced me that I should leave the financial arrangements to them, as I was too distraught to deal with it. I didn't know any better and trusted them. They were my in-laws, my family. This was my first mistake. The first red flag appeared when I tried to get an update about my accounts. Richard always gave me vague responses, claiming that things were still in process with the probate court. He always had an explanation for everything, and I, still reeling from my loss, accepted it. He had promised me regular updates, but they never materialized. He always seemed to be too busy. I started noticing strange expenses on the bank statements that I was able to access through my mobile app. Small, recurring charges that I couldn't place, and when I asked about them, Eleanor would brush them off as clerical errors and promise to look into them. I had become increasingly suspicious, but the pain of grief made it difficult to process the possibility of deception from my in-laws. I was still very much in mourning, I was exhausted, and the idea that people I trusted would harm me never crossed my mind. However, as the weeks turned into months, and the vague explanations persisted, my suspicions deepened. I started keeping track of the small expenses, creating a spreadsheet to analyze where the money was going. The patterns began to emerge. Small withdrawals were being made regularly, each one under the radar, but adding up to a substantial amount over time. The withdrawals seemed to be occurring right before their weekend getaways to the mountains, where they spent time at their vacation home, a lavish property that I had always assumed they had paid for themselves. During my research, I also noticed payments for designer items on the debit cards that they were using, which further intensified my suspicions. One evening, while helping Eleanor organize some old documents, I stumbled upon a folder labeled Mark's Estate. I couldn't resist taking a look. Inside, I found copies of bank statements and financial transaction records that were significantly different from the ones I had received. They showed a much higher inheritance amount than I had been told, and numerous transfers to accounts under the Thornton family names. I felt as if the earth had shifted from beneath my feet, and that I had been foolishly naive to not realize sooner. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I could feel the anger rising within me. The realization that I had been systematically defrauded hit me hard. The next day, I approached David with my concerns. I thought that maybe, just maybe, he was not in on it and would be willing to help me. However, he quickly became defensive and dismissive, even implying that I was being greedy and ungrateful. It became clear that he was complicit in the scheme. He was in on it, and that realization broke my heart. As for Susan, she was even more dismissive than David. She had even gone as far as to say that Mark had always been irresponsible with money and that it was better in the hands of competent adults. She had always looked down on me, but this was the first time that she had openly insulted my late husband. I was infuriated and more determined than ever to get to the bottom of this. That's when I decided to enlist the help of a forensic accountant. I told her my story and concerns and gave her all the documentation I had found. After weeks of intense investigation, she presented me with a detailed report confirming my fears. The Thornton family had indeed been systematically transferring my inheritance to their accounts, masking the transactions as routine expenses and business investments. They were siphoning every last penny, slowly but surely, to bleed me dry. They had been stealing right in front of me, behind my back, and I had been none the wiser. The report was a cold, hard confirmation of the betrayal, and the depth of their deception left me reeling. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, I began to plan my next move. The annual Thornton family gathering was just a week away. It was a tradition the family had upheld for years, where the extended family met to celebrate. I knew that this would be the ideal platform to expose them. It would not be the usual cordial affair, I would make sure of that. The day of the family gathering arrived, and I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. I dressed meticulously, wanting to project an image of strength and composure. I arrived at the Thornton family home, the same house that had become a symbol of their treachery. The house was bustling with relatives, their voices echoing with laughter and cheerful chatter, all seemingly oblivious to the storm that was about to erupt. Richard greeted me with a forced smile, his eyes holding a hint of unease, an emotion I hadn't seen him show before. Eleanor gave me a tight hug, her voice a little too sweet. David and Susan exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of arrogance and nervousness. They seemed to have anticipated my presence as an annoyance, nothing else. As the party progressed, I engaged in polite conversations, masking my inner turmoil with a veneer of normalcy. I waited for the right moment, letting the tension build like an impending storm. Finally, after dinner was served, Richard stood up, clinking his glass to gain everyone's attention. He started his customary toast, filled with platitudes about family and love, words that now sounded hollow and sickening to me. "We are so grateful to have such a wonderful family," Richard announced, looking directly at me with a smug smile. He raised his glass and took a sip of wine. "To us," he concluded. I knew that this was my cue. "Actually," I interrupted, my voice clear and steady, silencing the room. "I'd like to make a toast of my own." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to me, curious and a bit surprised. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly, but I held my head high. "I'd like to toast to the Thornton family, a family who claims to value honesty and loyalty, but in reality, they have been nothing but dishonest and deceitful." I could hear Eleanor gasp, her face turning pale. Richard's fake smile faltered, replaced by a look of anger. David and Susan exchanged nervous glances. I continued, my voice gaining in strength and conviction. "Specifically, I'd like to toast to Richard and Eleanor, who have been systematically stealing from me for the past few months, taking my late husband's inheritance and transferring it into their accounts." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Everyone's eyes were wide with shock. Richard slammed his glass on the table, the sound echoing through the silent dining room. "Adeline, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous. You're just distraught from losing Mark, you're not thinking clearly," he yelled. "I can assure everyone that your accusations are false." Eleanor chimed in, her voice shaking, "This is a despicable thing to say. You're hurting us so much after everything we've done for you." I ignored them, my focus on exposing their lies. "I have proof," I declared, placing the forensic accountant's report on the table, along with copies of all the bank statements and transaction records. The documents spread across the table, irrefutable evidence of their treachery. I saw Richard's face turn crimson, and Eleanor began to cry, but they were crocodile tears. David and Susan looked like they had seen a ghost. I continued, "These documents show that you have been transferring funds from my inheritance into your accounts. All the while, you pretended to care. You acted as if I was part of the family, all while scheming behind my back." The room was in chaos. The cousins, aunts, and uncles looked at one another, their faces etched with disbelief. Some started to whisper, while others were silently staring at Richard and Eleanor. "How could you do this? I trusted you," I exclaimed, my voice laced with pain. The tears were now threatening to spill. "You took advantage of my grief, manipulated my trust, and stole what was rightfully mine." Richard and Eleanor began to deny it, their voices rising in panic, but no one believed them. I looked at the people around me, and all I could see was shock and disgust. Even the younger members of the family were gasping at the betrayal. You all saw them as the perfect people. You all trusted them. But now, you can all see their true colors. They are nothing more than greedy, heartless criminals. I felt a sense of catharsis as the truth finally came out. Susan tried to intervene, attempting to take the documents, but I pulled them away from her grasp. "This is not how you raise a family, Susan," I said with disgust, "and you're complicit too. You've all been complicit in this." David tried to defend himself by saying that he wasn't aware of what was happening, but I knew he was lying. His face was covered in a thin layer of sweat. "We believed you were grieving too," said one of my aunts. "How could you do this to her?" said another cousin. They were all in shock. My words echoed through the room, and for the first time, I had the satisfaction of seeing them completely exposed for what they were. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was chaotic. The family was divided, some in shock, others expressing their disgust at Richard and Eleanor. The room echoed with raised voices and accusations. Several family members turned on the Thorntons, demanding answers and expressing their disappointment. They had always presented themselves as pillars of respectability, and their facade had now completely crumbled. Richard and Eleanor, initially defiant, eventually became withdrawn and defensive, realizing that their web of deceit was unraveling. They knew they had been exposed in front of the entire family, and they had nothing left to do but to try and run damage control. Richard tried to justify their actions by saying it was for the good of the family, and that he was worried that I would squander the inheritance, but no one believed him. Eleanor, who had been pretending to be so distraught, started to shout that I was a gold digger and that she had never liked me. All of their true feelings were coming out now, and it was a disgusting mess. David tried to convince everyone that he had no idea what was going on and that they had kept him in the dark, but nobody believed him. Susan was silent for the first time in her life, trying to maintain composure while her family's world fell apart. I watched them squirm, their desperation growing as they realized the gravity of their actions. The looks on their faces were worth more than any apology they could have given me. In the days that followed, the family remained in a state of turmoil. The Thornton family was fractured, with rifts forming along old fault lines. Several family members reached out to me, offering their support and apologizing for not seeing the truth sooner. Even some of the older members of the family admitted that they had always had some doubts about Richard and Eleanor's character, but they had never dared to voice them. I felt a sense of vindication, but it was also bittersweet. I had exposed the truth, but it had come at the cost of shattering a family that I had once naively wanted to be a part of. I realized that the Thornton family would never be the same. The once perfect facade had crumbled, revealing the ugliness that had been lurking beneath. I moved back into my own house, leaving the Thornton family residence behind. The house was filled with memories of Mark, of our love and dreams. I began to slowly rebuild my life. The legal proceedings against Richard and Eleanor began a process that was both exhausting and necessary. I knew that it would be a long road to justice, but I was determined to see it through. I also cut ties with David and Susan. They had become a permanent reminder of the betrayal and deception. I had a great support system now. I had started making friends in my writing circle, and some of my family had reached out as well. I realized that family doesn't necessarily mean blood, that it was more than a name. I was taking back my narrative. I began to focus on my writing once again, finding solace in the world of words. Writing had always been my refuge, my way of making sense of the world, and now, it helped me process the pain and betrayal I had endured. The experience had changed me. I was no longer the naive, trusting person I had been. I had learned a harsh lesson about the nature of greed and deception. I had been broken, but now I was stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The betrayal had hurt, but it had also empowered me to stand up for myself, to fight for what was right. It had been a devastating experience, but strangely, it had also set me free. The legal proceedings against Richard and Eleanor concluded with them being found guilty of fraud and theft. The judge ordered them to return all the stolen funds, and while I was able to get my money back, it would never fully compensate for the emotional distress they had caused. They were sentenced to a period of community service, and their once impeccable reputation was tarnished forever. In the end, all of their money and status wouldn't be able to buy back the respect that they had lost. Their family, once so proud of them, was ashamed and disgusted. Their reputation had been shattered into pieces, never to be put back together again. David and Susan were also implicated in the scheme, though to a lesser degree. They were never charged with any crimes, but they too suffered from their participation in the theft. Their careers had been damaged, and their reputations had been tarnished forever. The entire Thornton family was forever changed. The rift that had formed between them would be permanent. There were no more family gatherings, and the holiday celebrations were just a hollow memory. I decided to move forward, to create a life that was not defined by the greed and deception of the Thorntons. I sold the housemark and I had lived in. It had become too painful to remain there, filled with so many memories. I bought a small cabin in the mountains, a place where I could find peace and solitude. I started a foundation in Mark's name to help aspiring writers. It was a way of honoring his memory, and it also helped me heal from all the pain. I continued to write, to tell stories that explored the complexities of human relationships, the resilience of the human spirit, and the importance of standing up for truth and justice. My books became my legacy. Now and then, I would hear small updates about the Thorntons. They had become social outcasts, ostracized by their former friends and acquaintances. They had lost everything, their money, their reputation, and their family. They were alone, living with the consequences of their actions. I had chosen to not allow their actions to define me. I was not the victim, I was a survivor. I had taken control of my story. I decided to embrace the future, to create a life filled with purpose and meaning. I found new joy in my writing, in friendships, and the quiet beauty of the mountains. While the wounds of the past may never fully heal, I have learned to live with them. I was moving forward, and they would stay in the past. I was ready to move on and create my happy ending. I had learned the hard way to protect my heart, and always trust my instincts. My journey from trusting and loving to betrayed and heartbroken was a difficult one, but it taught me the importance of courage and the power of truth. I had to stand up for myself, expose my wrongdoings, and find my strength. The road to healing was long and arduous, but it was worth every step. I am sharing my story to remind you that no matter how dark the situation may seem, you have the strength to overcome it. If you have ever experienced similar situations or have been betrayed by people you trusted, please share your story in the comments below. You are not alone. Your experiences are valid, and your voice matters. Don't forget to like this video if you found it empowering and subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience and hope. Your support helps us share stories that will inspire us all.